70 people stood in a candlelit courtyard, champagne glasses raised, laughter bouncing off limestone walls, and every single one of them had come to watch a woman be destroyed on her birthday. Not a surprise party, not a celebration, an execution. Nadia Vaughn stood in the center of it all, surrounded by people who wore smiles that carried no warmth, who clinked glasses not in her honor but in anticipation of her downfall. Her husband sat 3 feet away with his mistress's hand resting on his shoulder. Her mother-in-law presided over the head of the table like a queen about to sentence a prisoner. Her sister-in-law moved through the crowd whispering poison into every ear that would listen, and 70 phones were recording every second of it. Her husband leaned forward, looked directly at her, and said 5 words that would have shattered most people. "She's always been replaceable, honestly." He shrugged. The crowd laughed. His mistress smiled. His mother nodded. Have you ever been in a room full of people who were supposed to love you and realized every single one of them was there to watch you fall? But here's what makes this story unlike anything you've ever heard. What none of them knew, not the husband who called her replaceable, not the mother-in-law who orchestrated this spectacle, not the mistress who believed she'd already won, was that 6 hours before this party began, Nadia had received a phone call that changed everything. Her mother had died that morning, and in dying, she had left Nadia something that would make her the most powerful person in that courtyard, in that city, in every room she would ever walk into for the rest of her life. A $50 billion real estate empire, protected by legal structures so airtight that not a single person laughing at her tonight could ever touch it. And Nadia chose to say nothing. She stood there. She let them laugh. She let them record. She let them dig their own graves with every insult, every toast, every cruel word captured on camera. What happened next didn't just change her life. It destroyed theirs. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to subscribe and drop a comment with your location and time zone. I love seeing where my amazing audience is watching from around the world. Now, let's begin. To understand why this night mattered, you have to understand the 12 years that came before it. Because Nadia Vaughn wasn't always the woman standing silent in that courtyard, absorbing cruelty like armor absorbs arrows. She was once a woman who believed in love so completely that she handed her entire life to someone who never deserved it. She met Dominic Vaughn when she was 25 years old, a graduate student in art restoration at a university where she spent her days carefully bringing damaged paintings back to life, coaxing color from canvases that the world had given up on. There was a poetry to that work, a patience and tenderness that defined who she was. She believed in the beauty of broken things. She believed that anything damaged could be made whole again if someone cared enough to try. Dominic was magnetic. There's no other word for it. He walked into a room, and the room rearranged itself around him. He was confident without being arrogant, attentive without being possessive, charming in a way that felt effortless because he had spent his entire life perfecting the performance. He pursued Nadia with an intensity that made her feel like the only person on earth who mattered. Flowers that arrived at her apartment 3 times a week. Handwritten letters slipped under her door. Phone calls at midnight just to hear her voice. She fell in love with the version of himself he showed her, and by the time she met the real Dominic, it was too late to unlove the illusion. The shift began the moment she entered the Vaughn family. It was subtle at first, so gradual that Nadia didn't recognize the bars forming around her until they were already locked. Beatrice Vaughn, Dominic's mother, was a woman who had built her entire identity on control, on hierarchy, on the absolute certainty that she decided who belonged and who didn't, who thrived and who suffered. And from the moment Nadia walked through her door, Beatrice decided she would suffer. It started with small corrections. The way Nadia dressed wasn't quite right. The way she spoke at dinner was too casual. The opinions she offered at family gatherings were gently dismissed, then firmly overruled, then openly mocked. Each correction felt minor on its own, a pebble tossed into a river. But over months and years, those pebbles formed a dam that blocked everything Nadia used to be, her ambitions, her confidence, her sense of self, until she barely recognized a woman staring back from the mirror. Dominic didn't protect her. That was the cruelest part. He didn't argue with his mother's assessments because arguing meant questioning the system that gave him power, that made him important, that allowed him to feel superior. He learned from Beatrice that love was transactional, that respect was earned through submission, and he applied those lessons to his marriage with mechanical precision. Renata, Dominic's younger sister, completed the architecture of control. She was the social assassin, the one who specialized in whispered cruelty and public humiliation disguised as honest observation. She could destroy a reputation with a single raised eyebrow and a carefully positioned comment. And she wielded that power against Nadia with the consistency of someone who had found their calling. Together, they created an ecosystem designed to convince Nadia that she was nothing. And the worst part? For 12 years, some part of her believed them. But there was one thing they never managed to take from her. One small, quiet rebellion she carried against her skin every single day. An antique cameo brooch pinned above her heart, carved from shell, framed in tarnished gold, depicting a woman whose expression seemed to shift depending on the light. Sometimes serene, sometimes defiant, always watching. And late one night, 3 years into the marriage, Nadia stood in the hallway outside the master bedroom and overheard Dominic speaking to his mother on the phone. His voice was casual, dismissive, the tone of a man discussing a minor inconvenience rather than a human being. "She'll never leave," he said. "Where would she even go?" Nadia pressed her hand against the cameo brooch, felt its carved edges dig into her palm, and made a decision she wouldn't fully understand until 12 years later. She didn't leave, but she stopped breaking. The morning of her 38th birthday arrived without ceremony. No card on the nightstand. No whispered happy birthday from the man sleeping on the other side of a bed that felt wider than any ocean. Dominic had left before dawn, his side of the mattress already cold by the time Nadia opened her eyes to a sky that was bruised and purple with the first suggestion of light. She found herself sitting on the floor of her walk-in closet. She did this sometimes, retreating to the small space between racks of clothes she hadn't chosen and shelves of shoes purchased to meet standards she hadn't set. It was the one place in this enormous house that felt proportional to how small they had made her feel. The closet didn't judge her. The closet didn't measure her worth against impossible metrics. The closet just held her, and some mornings, that was enough. Her phone rang at 6:14. The screen displayed a number she didn't recognize, a local area code attached to a name that meant nothing to her. Julian Ashford, attorney at law. She almost didn't answer. Lawyers calling at dawn never brought good news, and Nadia had absorbed enough bad news to last several lifetimes. But something made her pick up. Some instinct buried deep in the part of her brain that recognized the sound of a turning point before her conscious mind could catch up. "Mrs. Vaughn?" The voice was male, measured, professional, carrying the careful neutrality of someone accustomed to delivering information that would alter the course of lives. "My name is Julian Ashford. I'm calling regarding your mother." Nadia's hand tightened around the phone. Her mother, a woman she hadn't seen in 6 months because Beatrice's social calendar somehow always conflicted with visits. A woman who had grown frailer with each passing year, but whose eyes never lost their sharpness, whose mind remained a cathedral of intelligence even as her body became a crumbling chapel. "I'm deeply sorry to inform you that your mother passed away peacefully in her sleep in the early hours of this morning." The words entered Nadia's ears and traveled through her body like ice water poured into veins. The closet walls seemed to compress. The air thickened. She could hear the blood rushing in her own skull, a roaring tide that drowned everything else, and for a moment, perhaps several moments, perhaps an eternity, compressed into a handful of heartbeats, the world simply stopped. Her mother was dead. The woman who had braided her hair before school. The woman who had held her through nightmares. The woman who had looked at her on her wedding day with eyes full of something Nadia had mistaken for joy but now understood was fear. That woman was gone, permanently, irreversibly, completely gone. "Mrs. Vaughn, are you still there?" Nadia's voice, when it came, sounded like it belonged to someone else. "Yes, I understand this is devastating news, and I wish I could give you time to process before continuing, but your mother was very specific about the timing of this conversation. She insisted that you hear what I'm about to say on this day at this hour before anything else happens." Julian paused, and in that pause, Nadia heard the quality of his silence change. It shifted from sympathy to something more deliberate, more weighted, more purposeful. "Your mother spent the last 40 years building something extraordinary, Mrs. Vaughn, a real estate portfolio structured through a network of irrevocable trusts, holding companies, and legal entities spanning 17 states. The total value of the portfolio, as of last week's assessment, is approximately $50 billion. Nadia's breath stopped. "Everything has been transferred to you, every property, every trust, every corporation, every legal mechanism she constructed. And Mrs. Vaughn, I need you to understand something critical. These structures were not designed merely to hold wealth. They were designed to protect it. Specifically, to protect it from exactly the kind of people you are currently surrounded by. The words hung in the closet like smoke, curling into shapes she couldn't quite comprehend. $50 billion. An empire. Her mother, frail and quiet and dismissed by the Vaughn family as irrelevant, had been building a fortress for 4 decades while they weren't looking. Your husband cannot touch it, Julian continued, his voice growing quieter, more intense. His family cannot challenge it. The prenuptial agreement his mother insisted on, the one designed to ensure Vaughn assets would be protected from you now, functions in reverse. It protects your assets from him. Every legal avenue they might pursue has been anticipated and blocked. Your mother saw to that. Nadia pressed the phone harder against her ear, tears streaming down her face, grief and revelation colliding inside her chest like 2 rivers meeting. She knew Mrs. Vaughn. Julian's voice softened for the first time. She knew exactly what they were doing to you. She watched it happen, and it broke her heart. But instead of confronting them, instead of rescuing you in a way they could counteract, she spent the last years of her life ensuring that when the time came, you wouldn't just survive their cruelty, you would be untouchable. Nadia sat on the floor of her closet, surrounded by another woman's choices, inside another family's house, wearing the brooch of a grandmother she had never met, and she understood for the first time that she had never been alone, not for a single day. Her mother had been fighting for her from the shadows, building weapons out of patience and paperwork, constructing an army of legal protections that would march to war on a single command. "There's a party tonight," Nadia whispered. "I know," Julian said. "Your mother told me about it. She predicted what would happen. She told me to let it happen, didn't she?" The silence on the other end of the line was its own answer. "Their cruelty is evidence, Mrs. Vaughn. Every insult, every recording, every moment of public humiliation strengthens your position when the truth comes out. Your mother understood that. She wanted them to show the world exactly who they are before the world learns exactly who you are." Nadia closed her eyes. The tears were still falling, but something beneath them had shifted. Something cold and precise and ancient had settled into her spine like steel reinforcing bone. "I'll be there tonight," she said. "I won't say a word." "I'll be watching from outside," Julian replied. "You won't be alone." She hung up the phone, pressed the cameo brooch against her chest, and let herself grieve. For 10 minutes she was simply a daughter who had lost her mother, the most important person in her world, the architect of her salvation. She cried without restraint, without performance, without apology. And then she stood up, washed her face, put on the dress Beatrice had selected for the occasion, pinned the cameo brooch above her heart, and walked into war. The brooch had a history that stretched back further than Nadia's lifetime, further than her mother's, further than the century itself. It had been carved in a small workshop in the south of France by an artisan whose name had been lost to time, commissioned by a woman whose name had not, Marguerite. She was Nadia's great-grandmother, a seamstress in Marseille whose hands could transform ordinary fabric into extraordinary garments, but whose own life was dressed in poverty and limitation. She married into a wealthy textile family at 20, a union arranged by parents who believed they were securing their daughter's future. Instead, they delivered her into a prison furnished with silk curtains. The parallels between Marguerite's story and Nadia's were so precise they felt almost predestined, as if the universe had a habit of testing the women in this family with the same cruel examination, generation after generation, to see if the lesson would finally be learned. Marguerite's mother-in-law treated her like hired help. Her husband watched in silence while his family stripped her dignity away one interaction at a time. She was criticized for how she spoke, how she dressed, how she held her fork, how she breathed too loudly, how she existed too visibly in spaces they considered theirs. But Marguerite possessed something her husband's family never suspected. She understood money the way a musician understands melody, intuitively, structurally, with an instinct for patterns that others couldn't perceive. She began investing in small properties using earnings from alterations she performed for wealthy women who valued her skill. A storefront here, a modest apartment building there, each acquisition made under a different name, through a different intermediary, protected by layers of paperwork that made tracing ownership nearly impossible. Over 30 years, while her husband's family spent lavishly and managed poorly, Marguerite's secret portfolio grew. Quietly, steadily, relentlessly. By the time the textile empire began to falter under the weight of its own excess, Marguerite's modest investments had become a foundation solid enough to support generations. She never confronted them, never raised her voice, never demanded they acknowledge what they had done to her. She simply outlasted them, outmaneuvered them, and when their world finally collapsed, she stood in the ruins and built something new, something that would protect every daughter and granddaughter and great-granddaughter who came after her. The cameo brooch was the symbol of that legacy. The woman carved in shell, her expression shifting between peace and defiance, represented every woman who had ever been underestimated and chose to prove them wrong, not through confrontation, but through quiet, devastating competence. Inside the brooch's frame, barely visible unless you knew where to look, was an inscription etched in letters so fine they required perfect light to read. Still waters carved the deepest canyons. Nadia's mother had given her this brooch on the morning of her wedding, pressing it into her hands with a gravity that had seemed excessive at the time. "The women in our family don't break," she had said, her fingers lingering on the tarnished gold frame. "We bend, we wait, and then we rise." Have you ever held something small in your hands, a ring, a photograph, a letter folded so many times the creases have become permanent, that carried the weight of an entire family's history? Something that reminded you who you were when the world was doing everything in its power to make you forget? That's what the cameo brooch was to Nadia. Not jewelry, not decoration, armor. A physical connection to women who had survived worse and emerged stronger. A covenant passed from mother to daughter saying, "You are not alone, you have never been alone, and the strength you need is already inside you because we put it there." Tonight, as Nadia prepared to walk into a courtyard filled with people who wanted to destroy her, the brooch pressed against her chest like a second heartbeat, steady and warm and absolutely unbreakable. The Vaughn estate sat on a hillside overlooking Napa Valley, a limestone fortress draped in ivy and old money, surrounded by vineyards that stretched toward the horizon like green velvet pulled taut over the earth. Iron lanterns lined the courtyard walls, casting warm pools of amber light that should have felt romantic, celebratory, alive with the kind of magic that makes birthday memories permanent. Instead, the light illuminated a stage set for cruelty. Nadia walked through the wrought iron gates at 7:15, her posture straight, her face composed, the cameo brooch pinned in its usual place above her heart. 70 guests were already assembled, arranged in clusters that mapped the family's social hierarchy with mathematical precision. The most important near Beatrice, the most loyal near Dominic, the most eager to participate near the center where the evening's entertainment would unfold. Violins played from a corner of the courtyard, a quartet Beatrice had hired because she believed culture was performed rather than felt. The music was technically flawless and emotionally empty, beautiful sounds arranged in patterns that signified sophistication without actually possessing it. Like everything else the Vaughn family produced, it was surface without substance. Beatrice stood at the head of the long table, her silver hair sculpted into a chignon so precise it looked architectural. She wore a charcoal dress that probably cost more than most people's cars, and an expression that promised something her guests had been anticipating all evening. She surveyed the courtyard the way a general surveys a battlefield, her eyes cataloging positions, measuring alliances, confirming that every piece was in place for the performance she had choreographed. Her hand rose, a small gesture, a flick of the wrist that wouldn't have been noticed in any normal setting. But this wasn't a normal setting, and Beatrice wasn't a normal woman. She was the conductor, and when she raised her hand, the orchestra obeyed. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Glasses paused at lips. Even the violins seemed to soften, as though the musicians themselves felt the shift in the room's gravity. "I want to say something about family," Beatrice began, her voice smooth as river stone and twice as cold. "About what it means to truly contribute. Each of us around this table brings something valuable. Dominic brings vision. Renata brings connections that have opened doors across 3 continents. Even our newest members bring fresh energy and ambition." She paused. Let the word newest settle. Let every eye in the courtyard follow her gaze to where Simone stood beside Dominic, gleaming in gold, a trophy polished for display. But contribution requires capability. It requires someone to actually possess something worth offering, and I find myself struggling year after year to identify what Nadia has brought to this family. The words detonated in the courtyard, not with explosion but with implosion, a quiet, devastating collapse of the fiction that this was a birthday party and not a public sentencing. "She has had every opportunity," Beatrice continued, warming to her subject the way a predator warms to a chase. "Every advantage this family name provides, and in 12 years she has produced nothing of value. No meaningful connections, no financial contribution, no social capital worth mentioning. She has been, to put it plainly, a passenger, occupying space that could be better used by someone worthy of it." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Heads nodded. Phones appeared in hands with the casual speed of reflexes trained by years of documenting other people's worst moments. Screens glowed like small predatory eyes, recording what would surely become the social event of the season. Dominic leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms with the easy confidence of a man who had never been required to earn anything he possessed. He looked at Nadia the way someone looks at outdated furniture. Not with anger, not even with contempt. With indifference, which was somehow worse, because contempt at least acknowledged your existence, while indifference erased it entirely. "My mother's right," he said, his voice projecting across the courtyard with practiced ease. "I spent 12 years hoping she'd grow into this family, rise to what's expected, but at some point you stop waiting and start being honest. She's always been more of a placeholder than a partner." A man near the bar, one of Dominic's investment partners, raised his glass. "Takes courage to say what everyone's already thinking." Another voice called out from a cluster of guests near the fountain. "She's had it easy for too long. Maybe it's time she heard the truth." The cruelty was infectious, spreading through the courtyard like fire through dry grass, each person eager to add their voice to the chorus, because joining in meant belonging, and belonging meant safety, and safety meant never becoming the next target. Renata materialized at Nadia's side, her perfume arriving before her words, something floral and aggressive that colonized the surrounding air. She held her wineglass at that precise angle that suggested casual elegance while actually demonstrating practiced control. "You know what's truly tragic," Renata said, her voice pitched at the exact volume that allowed the nearest cluster of guests to hear while maintaining the performance of intimacy. After 12 years, she still looks surprised, as if she expected something different, as if she genuinely believed the fairy tale. She turned to the women beside her, wives and daughters of wealth, women who measured their worth in invitation lists and seating charts. "It's almost endearing, like watching someone reach for a door that's already been locked." The women laughed. Their laughter was the cruelest sound in the courtyard, not because it was malicious but because it was casual, the effortless amusement of people for whom another woman's devastation was simply entertainment, a story they'd retell at brunch tomorrow with embellishments and mimosas. And then Simone stepped forward. She moved through the crowd like liquid gold, her dress catching every flicker of lantern light, her confidence so absolute it bordered on performance art. She was younger than Nadia by nearly a decade, taller by several inches, and she wore Dominic's attention like a crown, openly, proudly, daring anyone to question her right to it. She positioned herself beside Dominic, her hands sliding onto his shoulder, her fingers tracing the line of his collar in a gesture that was simultaneously intimate and deliberately theatrical. She looked across the courtyard at Nadia, and her expression held no guilt, no shame, no apology. Only the quiet satisfaction of someone who believed she had already claimed the prize. "Happy birthday, Nadia," Simone said, her voice carrying with crystal precision. "I hope this year brings you the clarity to finally see things as they are." The words were a knife dipped in honey, sweet on the surface, lethal beneath. Nadia stood perfectly still. Her face revealed nothing, not grief, not rage, not the nuclear secret burning behind her ribs. She was a lake frozen solid on the surface, while the current beneath moved with devastating force. Her hand rested on the cameo brooch, fingers tracing the carved woman's profile, drawing strength from shell and gold and the whispered courage of women who had endured worse. She memorized every face, catalogued every laugh, noted every phone recording her supposed destruction, not with vengeance, but with the meticulous attention of a woman assembling evidence, piece by piece, for a case that would be made not in a courtroom but in the ruins of an empire that didn't know it was already falling. If this story is making your blood boil, you're not alone. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what you would do in Nadia's shoes. And stay with me because what happens next changes everything. Across the road from the estate, parked beneath the heavy branches of an ancient oak tree, whose roots had been gripping that hillside for longer than the Vaughn name had existed, Julian Ashford sat in a rented sedan with his laptop open, his phone recording, and his conscience at war with his instructions. He had arrived before the first guest, had positioned himself with a clear sightline to the courtyard through the wrought iron gates, had watched 70 people arrive in vehicles that cost more than most families earned in a year, wearing outfits designed to project power they hadn't earned, carrying opinions about a woman they had never bothered to understand. And he had watched Nadia arrive last, watched her walk through those gates with her shoulders straight and her head held at an angle that reminded him so powerfully of her mother that his chest ached. The same posture, the same quiet dignity, the same refusal to perform weakness for people who fed on it. Julian's hand had found the door handle 9 times in the last hour. 9 moments when every instinct in his body screamed at him to cross that road, walk into that courtyard, and announce to every person holding a champagne glass that they were currently mocking a woman who owned the ground beneath their feet, the roof above their heads, and the future they took for granted. But each time, he had stopped himself, because Nadia's mother had been devastatingly specific in her final instructions. "Let them perform," she had said during their last meeting, her body frail but her mind a sharpened blade. "Let them show the world exactly who they are, because when the reversal comes, Julian and I have made certain it will come. There must be no ambiguity, no room for them to rewrite history, no possibility that anyone could look at what they did and feel sorry for them." She had gripped his wrist with surprising strength, her eyes burning with the fierce intelligence that had built an empire from nothing while the world looked the other way. "My daughter is stronger than they know, stronger than she knows. Tonight will prove it." So Julian sat. He documented. He recorded audio that drifted across the night air with brutal clarity. Every insult, every laugh, every toast made at Nadia's expense, captured in digital permanence that would later prove invaluable. And beneath his laptop, hidden in a leather portfolio, sat the documents that would end everything. Ownership transfers, trust amendments, corporate restructuring orders. Every property the Vaughn family considered theirs, every building, every business, every asset they had built their identity upon, was controlled by structures that Nadia now owned completely and irrevocably. What none of them knew, not Beatrice with her toasts, not Dominic with his smirk, not Renata with her whisper campaigns, not Simone with her golden dress and hollow victory, was that the mechanisms of their destruction had already been set in motion. Even as they laughed, silent algorithms were restructuring financial architectures. Ownership records were being updated across 17 states. Access credentials were being revoked, credit lines frozen, payment systems redirected with the quiet efficiency of a tide going out. Julian's phone buzzed. A text from his associate, Phase 1 initiated. All entities responding as expected. He typed back, "Continue." By Friday, they won't have a foundation to stand on. The response was immediate. Understood. The worse they are now, the less sympathy they get later. Julian set the phone down, looked through the gates at the courtyard where Beatrice was raising her glass for yet another toast, and clenched his jaw so hard his teeth ached. Soon, very soon. The night had been building toward this moment, the way a symphony builds toward its final movement, each section adding intensity, each instrument layering volume and complexity, until the air itself seemed to vibrate with accumulated force. Beatrice rose from her chair one final time. The courtyard responded with the trained silence of an audience that knew the headliner was about to perform. She held her glass high, the champagne catching the lantern light and glowing like liquid amber, and her smile was the kind that museums should display behind glass as a perfect specimen of cruelty wearing beauty's face. "One last toast," she said, her voice commanding absolute attention. "To truth, to standards, to knowing one's place in the world." She turned her gaze directly to Nadia, her meaning as subtle as a sledgehammer. "And to this family's future. A future that, I think we can all agree, looks considerably brighter without certain complications." The word complications landed in the courtyard like a verdict. 70 glasses rose. 70 voices echoed her words. The unified sound of collective cruelty, sanctioned by authority, performed by people who had traded their consciences for the comfort of belonging. But not everyone participated. A handful of guests kept their glasses low, their eyes averted, their lips pressed tight with the particular discomfort of people who recognized injustice, but valued self-preservation more than courage. They would remember this night. They would carry the shame of their silence like stones in their pockets for years to come. Nadia stood alone in the center of the courtyard, surrounded, recorded, mocked. Every condition designed to break her had been met. Every pressure had been applied. Every avenue of escape had been blocked, and she did not break. She looked at Beatrice. Not with anger, not with tears, not with defeat. She looked at her with an expression the matriarch couldn't categorize, something calm and knowing and quietly terrifying, the expression of someone who holds a secret so devastating that the simple act of keeping it becomes its own form of power. And then Nadia spoke. Her voice was steady, clear, unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world, because she did. "You know what I've learned from the women in my family, Beatrice? That the people who spend the most energy proving their power are usually the ones who are about to lose it. Silence, not the trained silence of an audience awaiting direction. Real silence. The kind that fills a space when something true has been spoken and the air itself needs a moment to absorb it. Beatrice's smile remained fixed, but something behind it shifted. A flicker of uncertainty darted across her eyes like a fish breaking the surface of still water, there and gone before anyone could confirm they'd seen it. Renata laughed, too loudly, the sound brittle and forced. Dominic shifted in his chair, uncrossing and recrossing his arms. Simone's hand tightened on his shoulder. The moment passed. The crowd returned to their conversations. The violins resumed. The champagne continued to flow, but the crack had appeared. Hairline thin, invisible to anyone not looking for it, but real. And cracks, as Nadia's grandmother had known, as her mother had understood, as Nadia herself was about to prove, don't heal on their own. They spread. Nadia touched the cameo brooch one final time and made a silent promise to the women who had carried it before her. This ends with me. Beatrice Vaughn woke at 7 the following morning to find that her primary credit card had been declined during an automatic payment scheduled overnight. She stared at the notification on her phone with the particular confusion of someone who had never in her life been told no by a financial institution. A glitch, she decided. An error. These things happen to other people, and occasionally, through no fault of the system, they happen to people like her. She dismissed it and rang her assistant. By 8:30, the dismissal had become difficult to maintain. Her property manager called about their flagship commercial building downtown, a gleaming tower that bore the Vaughn name in brushed steel letters 3 feet tall. There were compliance issues, he said, his voice carrying the nervous vibration of a man delivering news he didn't fully understand. New documentation requirements from an ownership entity he'd never encountered. Requests for re-verification of management authority. Forms that needed signatures from people whose names he didn't recognize. Beatrice hung up and called Dominic. Dominic was already dealing with his own cascade of impossibilities. He had arrived at his office to discover that 3 major pending deals had been frozen. Not canceled. Frozen. Suspended in a bureaucratic limbo that no one could explain and no one seemed authorized to resolve. His business partners were receiving letters from law firms they had never heard of, referencing ownership structures that contradicted everything they believed about who controlled what. He made calls. Attorneys who normally answered on the first ring let calls go to voicemail. Financial advisors who typically responded within minutes suddenly needed time to review the situation. The responsive, obedient infrastructure of wealth and privilege that the Vaughn family had relied on for decades was developing mysterious delays, unexplained complications, bureaucratic friction that felt intentional but couldn't be proven. Renata's collapse was social rather than financial, but no less devastating. The women who had attended the birthday party, who had laughed and raised their glasses and clinked champagne flutes in celebration of Nadia's humiliation, began receiving communications. Discreet letters from legal firms suggesting that their social proximity to certain families might create complicated liabilities given ongoing restructuring of asset ownership in the region. The language was deliberately vague, designed not to inform but to unsettle, to plant seeds of doubt that would grow into distance. The whisper network Renata had built, the intricate web of social connections she had cultivated and weaponized over years, began turning against her with the speed of a river reversing course. Women who had eagerly repeated her cruel observations about Nadia were now whispering about Renata herself. The calls stopped coming. The invitations dried up. The doors that had always opened at the sound of her name began, one by one, to close. And Simone? The luxury apartment Dominic had set her up in, the one with the city views and the Italian marble and the walk-in closet that was larger than most studio apartments, was owned by a trust that had just undergone management transition. A courier arrived at noon with a notice the property was being repurposed. She had 30 days to vacate. She called Dominic. He didn't answer. She called again. Voicemail. She called a third time, and his assistant informed her that Mr. Vaughn was dealing with urgent matters and could not be reached. By noon, the pattern was undeniable. This wasn't a series of coincidences. This was coordinated, systematic. Something was happening beneath the surface of their world, invisible forces pulling at the foundations of everything they had built, and they couldn't trace it, couldn't stop it, couldn't even identify what it was. Panic replaced arrogance with the speed of a light switch flipping. Isn't it interesting how the loudest people in the room always fall the hardest? Stay with me, because this family hasn't hit bottom yet. 1 week after the birthday party, Nadia called a meeting. Not at the Vaughn estate, not on their territory, surrounded by their symbols of power, anchored by their rules. She chose a location that would deliver the message before a single word was spoken, the 23rd floor of a downtown high-rise that the Vaughn family had only recently discovered they no longer controlled. The conference room was glass-walled, overlooking the city in every direction, sunlight pouring across a mahogany table where Julian Ashford had arranged documents. In precise stacks, each one labeled, each one notarized, each one representing a piece of the empire Nadia's mother had built and the family had never known existed. Beatrice arrived first. She entered the conference room with her chin elevated and her posture rigid, wearing authority like armor even as the ground beneath her feet was crumbling. Behind her came Dominic, his jaw tight, his eyes carrying the particular anxiety of a man who suspects he's lost something enormous but hasn't yet confirmed it. Renata followed last, silent for perhaps the first time in her adult life, her social radar detecting a power dynamic she couldn't map. Simone was conspicuously absent. She had disappeared 3 days earlier, vanishing from the apartment she'd been asked to vacate with the same speed and efficiency she had used to insert herself into Dominic's life. When the money evaporated, so did she. Some people reveal their true nature in crisis. Others simply reveal that they never had one. Nadia was already seated when they arrived. She wore a simple black dress, no jewelry except the cameo brooch pinned above her heart, and her expression was something none of them had ever seen on her face before. Not anger, not triumph, not the bitter satisfaction of revenge. Composure. The absolute unshakable composure of a woman who had nothing left to prove and everything left to protect. She was not the silent figure from the birthday party. She was not the woman they had spent 12 years diminishing. She was someone they were meeting for the first time, and the recognition of that fact passed across their faces like a shadow. "Sit down," Nadia said. Not a request, not a suggestion. An instruction delivered with quiet authority. They sat. Julian opened the first folder and began speaking in the measured tones of a man who had spent 30 years delivering information that changed lives. He explained the trusts, the holding companies, the corporate structures spanning 17 states, the properties, hundreds of them, commercial buildings and residential complexes and development sites and landmark holdings that collectively formed one of the largest private real estate portfolios in the country. He explained that every property the Vaughn family considered theirs, every building that bore their name, every asset they had built their identity upon, was owned by entities that Nadia's mother had created, funded, and structured over 4 decades. The Vaughn family had been operating on borrowed power, managing properties they didn't own, profiting from structures they didn't control, building reputations on foundations they had never actually laid. The room was silent. Not the performative silence of the birthday party, but the genuine, devastating silence of people watching their world dissolve. Beatrice spoke first, her voice carrying a tremor she couldn't quite control. "This is absurd. These properties are ours. We have documentation. We have contracts. You have management agreements," Julian interrupted, his tone polite but immovable. "Agreements that were structured to appear like ownership but function as tenancy. Your mother-in-law's predecessor established many of these relationships decades ago, and Mrs. Vaughn's mother acquired the underlying ownership through legitimate market transactions over a period of 40 years. Every acquisition is documented. Every transfer is legal. Every structure has been reviewed by independent counsel and confirmed as airtight." Dominic's face had drained of color. He looked at Nadia, as though seeing her for the first time, and in a way, he was. "Nadia," he said, his voice attempting charm and landing on desperation. "We can work this out. We're still married. Whatever is yours is—" "Nothing is yours." Julian's interruption was surgical. "The prenuptial agreement your mother insisted on, the one designed to protect Vaughn assets from your wife, now functions precisely as written. It protects each party's individual assets from the other. Mrs. Vaughn's assets, which constitute the entirety of the portfolio I've just described, are completely and permanently beyond your reach." The irony was so complete, so perfectly constructed, that it felt almost like poetry. The legal weapon Beatrice had forged to keep Nadia powerless was now the very mechanism that made Nadia untouchable. Renata stared at the documents as though they might rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic if she looked long enough. Beatrice's hands gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, her composure cracking invisible fault lines across her face. And Nadia spoke, not with cruelty, not with gloating, with truth. "You spent 12 years teaching me that I was nothing," she said, her voice steady and clear and absolutely unbreakable. "You criticized how I dressed, how I spoke, how I breathed in spaces you considered yours. You told me I had no connections, no value, no reason to be kept around. You humiliated me on my birthday in front of 70 people and recorded it for entertainment." She paused. Let the silence work. "My mother spent 40 years proving that I was everything. She built this empire while you were too busy looking down on her to notice what she was doing. She protected it with structures so thorough that the best legal minds in the country couldn't dismantle them if they tried for a decade." She looked at each of them in turn. Beatrice, Dominic, Renata. She gave each face the same calm, unflinching attention they had given her humiliation. "The difference between your assessment and hers is simple. She was right. If you're feeling the power of this moment, share this video with someone who needs to hear that their silence is not weakness, it's preparation. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Love Chronicles with Mr. Incredible so you never miss a story like this. The collapse of the Vaughn family was not dramatic in the way Hollywood portrays destruction. There were no explosions, no public meltdowns, no courtroom screaming matches. It was quiet, methodical, inevitable, like watching a building settle into its own foundation after the supports have been removed, slow enough to observe, too complete to stop. Beatrice lost the only thing that had ever truly mattered to her, relevance. Nadia didn't destroy her financially, didn't leave her destitute, didn't mirror the cruelty that had been inflicted on her. She simply restructured the management agreements, removed the Vaughn name from properties that had never actually belonged to them, and redirected the family's social and financial influence toward entities they couldn't access or control. For a woman who had built her entire identity on presiding over rooms full of obedient admirers, irrelevance was worse than poverty. Beatrice Vaughn became invisible, a fate she had spent her entire life inflicting on others, and was now wholly unprepared to endure herself. Dominic's reckoning was both financial and personal. The divorce proceedings were swift, decisive, and protected by the very prenuptial agreement his mother had insisted on. Every clause designed to shield Vaughn assets from Nadia now shielded Nadia's assets from him. He was left with nothing that hadn't been given to him by structures his wife now controlled, and the realization that he had destroyed the only person who had ever genuinely loved him settled into his chest like a stone that would never be dislodged. Simone was long gone, having vanished with the same efficiency she'd used to appear, a woman whose loyalty had been rented rather than earned, whose affection had been conditional on access to resources that no longer existed. Renata experienced a particular kind of justice. The social network she had spent years weaponizing, the whisper campaigns and cocktail party assassinations and carefully positioned cruelties, turned on her with devastating speed. The birthday party recordings, the ones captured on 70 phones and shared across social media, in group chats and email chains, became evidence not of Nadia's humiliation but of the family's character. People watched those videos and saw not a weak woman being put in her place, but a grieving daughter being savaged by predators on the day her mother died. The narrative flipped. The weapons the family had created destroyed them. Renata, who had specialized in making others feel excluded, now knew what exclusion felt like from the inside. And it was worse than anything she had imagined, because she had always assumed that being on the other side of cruelty meant being protected from it. The recordings became central to the public understanding of what had happened. Every phone that had been raised that night, every camera that had captured Nadia's supposed defeat, had instead documented a crime of dignity so thorough and so public that no amount of reputation management could reframe it. The family had built their own prosecution, had filmed their own evidence, had distributed their own conviction across every platform that would host it. Nadia channeled the empire her mother had built into something that would have made Marguerite weep with pride. She established a foundation dedicated to supporting women trapped in controlling family dynamics, funding legal representation for those who couldn't afford to fight the systems designed to keep them powerless. She created scholarships for women whose educational ambitions had been suppressed by families that valued obedience over achievement. She built networks that connected women in crisis with resources, advocates, and communities that understood what it meant to be slowly dismantled by the people who were supposed to love you. She didn't just survive, she transformed. And the transformation wasn't about wealth or power or revenge. It was about purpose, about taking every lesson learned in 12 years of quiet endurance and using it to ensure that other women wouldn't have to endure as long as she had. The cameo brooch found its permanent home not in a jewelry box or a vault, but displayed on a shelf in Nadia's office at the foundation headquarters. She placed it where she could see it every day, where its carved woman's shifting expression, sometimes serene, sometimes defiant, could remind her of the covenant she had inherited and the promise she had kept. Still waters carve the deepest canyons. Her mother never got to see her rise. never got to witness the moment when the empire she had spent 40 years building became the instrument of her daughter's liberation. But that was the nature of the gift she had given. It wasn't designed for the giver. It was designed for the one who needed it most, offered without expectation of gratitude, constructed without hope of recognition, delivered from beyond the threshold of life itself. That's what love does. It protects, even after the person who loves you is gone. This story isn't just about a woman who inherited billions. It's about a woman who inherited something far more valuable, the knowledge that her silence was never weakness. It was a strategy passed down through generations of women who understood that endurance isn't the absence of power. It's the most dangerous form of it. If you take anything from Nadia's story, let it be this: never confuse someone's silence with surrender. The quietest person in the room might be the one holding all the cards. The people who spend the most energy tearing you down are always the ones who fear what you'll become when you stand up. Their cruelty isn't evidence of your inadequacy. It's evidence of their terror. Real power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't perform for crowds or seek validation from people who measure worth in volume. Real power waits. It watches. And when it moves, it doesn't leave room for recovery. And your value, your real value, is never determined by the people who refuse to see it. It's determined by the people who loved you enough to build bridges you wouldn't need until they were gone. Nadia's mother never got to see her daughter rise. But she built the staircase anyway. Brick by brick, trust by trust, document by document, year after quiet year, she constructed a path from darkness to light and trusted that her daughter would find it when the time was right. Because that's what love does. It doesn't rescue. It prepares. It doesn't shield you from pain. It ensures that pain has a purpose. It doesn't guarantee you won't fall. It guarantees that when you stand back up, you'll be holding everything you need. So the next time someone tells you that you're nothing, smile. Touch whatever talisman keeps you grounded, a ring, a photo, a memory, a name whispered in the dark. And remember the inscription on a cameo brooch that traveled through 4 generations of women who refused to be broken. Still waters carve the deepest canyons. If this story moved you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to Love Chronicles with Mr. Incredible for more stories that remind you of your power. And drop a comment below. Tell me, what would you have done in Nadia's shoes? I read every single comment, and I can't wait to hear from you. Until next time, remember, your silence isn't weakness, it's preparation, and your moment is coming.